Courts and aristocratic circles were places where women had both the time and the means to damage their hair for the sake of fashion. Some believe this obsession spread to the merchant and middle classes, especially in cities like Venice and Florence, where visual culture thrived and appearance equated to opportunity. There's even proof that men participated, not with hair color, but by writing endless poems to sun-kissed maidens and golden angels. This poetic imagery set high standards, and women were expected to meet them, ignoring genetics and chemistry. They turned to bleach, praying and roasting in the sun like delicate glowing meatballs. Now, back in your room, you sit by the window with a burning scalp. You've followed the recipe from that whispered beauty manual. The sun blazes down through the hole in your straw hat. Your hair steams and you faintly smell of lemons and livestock. A servant lazily fans you. You feel drained, though maybe it's just the fumes. Later, at court, someone glances your way. Your hair catches the candlelight and shimmers for a moment. You think, maybe this was worth it. Then, someone else turns to look. You smile faintly and remind yourself not to scratch your head, as it still stings. At this point, you've likely realized that medieval beauty was less about being vibrant and more about appearing as if you were fading away. But don't assume that this obsession with delicate looks meant people actually smelled delicate. Welcome to the grim side of medieval beauty culture, where baths were rare, sweat was constant, and your nose worked hard to get you through each day without fainting. First of all, medieval people weren't completely opposed to washing. They bathed, more than myths suggest, when they could. But for noble women, hygiene was about appearance rather than health. You were expected to smell fresh and floral without actually getting wet. Bathing was often seen as potentially harmful to one's soul or fertility. Experts at the time claimed that hot water opened your pores, making you more susceptible to disease or sin. Nothing says medical knowledge like blaming your bathtub for a plague outbreak. So, what did women do instead? They used a lot of perfume. They doused themselves in rose water, lavender oils, crushed violets, and even spiced vinegar. Some even stuffed their undergarments with dried herbs like mint, marjoram, and thyme, essentially turning their corsets into medieval potpourri. Sachets, linen chemises and veils were cleaned more often than their bodies, all in an attempt to make it seem like they were clean. Then came the scent masks, not those for COVID, but ones like perfumed gloves, pomanders, small balls filled with aromatic resins, and garlands worn around the neck or pinned into dresses. These weren't just for decoration, they were protective gear. The upper classes understood that odors were a problem. The trick was to have a more pleasant smell. Let's talk about hair care, since you just tortured it. If you thought scalp treatment was a modern obsession, think again. Medieval women often went weeks without washing their hair, instead rubbing it with scented oils to hide the natural buildup. Rosemary, clove oil, and bay leaves were popular choices, not for cleanliness, but to mask the fact that your hair was a small ecosystem. One quirky tip from a 14th century beauty manual advised boiling rosemary in wine and using the mix to rinse the hair and clear the mind. It sounds nice until you remember how often lice made themselves comfortable in those braids and veils. Delousing was a constant, itchy challenge. Women used special combs, vinegar rinses, and lots of prayers. Not everyone could afford the luxury of smell-masking oils and herbs. For poorer women, especially in cities, public bathhouses were a more realistic option until the church deemed them too sinful. Bathing in the same room as others was seen as a path to lust, disease, and moral decline. Many bathhouses were shut down or heavily regulated. Women were expected to wash modestly at home, with a basin, a cloth, and whatever level of shame they could muster. But here's where it gets contradictory. The same society that criticized women for washing too much also expected them to look and smell perfect, not just clean but spiritually fragrant. Writers of the time described their ideal women as smelling like lilies, honey, or spring rain, never sweat, never food, and certainly never reality. The pressure to smell right wasn't equal. Noble women faced impossible standards. They had to endure hours in court, layered in heavy clothing and stuffy rooms, yet still radiate the scent of divine approval. One misstep in odor, and gossip would start. One historical figure worth mentioning is Isolde of Brittany, often overshadowed by the famous Isolde in the Tristan legend. She was praised not just for her golden hair and pale skin but for smelling like flowers even after traveling. Whether that was poetic exaggeration or the outcome of an extreme perfume habit is unclear, but the idea stuck. The perfect woman didn't just look good. She smelled like a meadow in May. Of course, scholars debate how seriously we should take all this. Some historians argue that medieval people were far more practical than we assume, always keeping one eye over their shoulder, because in the medieval world, being seen as impure was not just a matter of gossip. It could ruin your life. Here you are, sitting in the garden, under your chaperone's watchful eye. You speak softly, hands folded and eyes downcast. You're 13, but you've memorized the expectations. You must be beautiful, but not too much. Show innocence, but avoid being naive. Be seen but not heard. You hear a giggle from behind the hedge. Another girl, perhaps, less careful than you, might be whispering with a page boy. You tense, not out of jealousy, but because you understand how quickly that kind of thing can turn into a story. In this world, a single story can define your legacy. You've perfected the holy trifecta: pale, quiet, and virginal. Still, something's missing: your hair. Your crown is not just there by chance. In the medieval world, your hair color could make or break your life. If you wanted elite beauty status, only one color would do: blonde. Not honey, not brassy yellow. We're talking luminous, sun-kissed strands of spun gold, preferably glowing like a holy halo under candlelight. If you weren't born with it, too bad. You'd have to fake it, even if it meant burning your scalp with homemade bleach. This obsession with golden hair didn't arise from nowhere. In medieval Europe, blonde was a symbol of purity, youth, and divine grace. Artists painted angels and saints with flowing blonde hair, even if those figures came from places where blonde hair wasn't common. The symbolism ran deep. Blonde meant divine, delicate, and likely meant you'd die young. Wasn't that just lovely? For brunettes and redheads, this was a problem. So women got to work with a variety of dangerous DIY treatments to lighten their hair. One method involved soaking hair in a mixture of lye, alum, and stale urine. Yes, urine before sitting in the sun for hours. It didn't always work, but when it did, you'd end up with dry, straw-like blonde strands and likely chemical burns. Beauty win? Maybe. Nerve damage? Possibly. One infamous beauty recipe from a 15th century Italian manuscript instructed women to mix saffron, lemon juice, and goat's urine, apply it to their hair, and sit outside with a wide-brimmed hat that had the top cut out, so just their hair would roast in the sun. The goal was to lift the pigment. Sometimes it worked, but usually it just fried your hair into a crispy halo of medieval regret. And don't think you could just wear a wig. Wigs were rare and seen as theatrical or deceptive. Plus, they were extremely hot and itchy under layers of wimples and veils. Some women used thin veils dyed with golden hues to create the illusion of blonde hair, but it was no substitute for the real thing. You wanted the shine, the shimmer, the approval of everyone from your priest to your suitor. If it cost you your scalp, so be it. Let's consider Lucretia Borgia. Though she lived just after the medieval period, during the early Renaissance, her golden hair was so famous that it was sent as a diplomatic gift. Strands of her hair were even preserved in jewelry and letters as symbols of power and allure. Whether her hair was natural or achieved through early bleaching is up for debate, but the point is clear: golden hair signified influence. It turned women into legends, or at least well-married nobles. This beauty ideal pushed aside entire populations. Dark-haired women, especially those from Southern Europe or the Middle East, were often portrayed as seductive, dangerous, or morally ambiguous. In medieval poetry, a dark-haired temptress usually spelled trouble for the hero, while the golden-haired maiden was the one he'd bring home to his castle. The racial and cultural undertones allowed blonde to mean not just beautiful but better. Now here's where it gets interesting. While the church advocated for modesty and chastity, romantic literature of the time, courtly love tales, and troubadour poetry fueled the obsession with blonde hair even more. In these stories, the perfect lady was always golden-haired, gentle, and mysteriously sad. Men fell to their knees for her, sang ballads under her window, or died defending her honor. Blonde hair became a symbol not just of holiness, but of high drama. Naturally, women tried to emulate this ideal, even knowing it was fictional and dangerous. There's a documented case from 14th century England of a noblewoman who went blind after accidentally getting bleach in her eyes while trying to match the golden shade of a lady in a painting. Art imitating life, or life imitating art. With a side of permanent eye damage, the consequences weren't always so visible. Repeated chemical treatments led to hair loss, infections, and open sores on the scalp. And let's not forget the smell. Many of these bleaching agents, especially those that included urine, left women smelling like farm animals in the summer. You'd walk into court looking like Aphrodite but smelling like the stables, the things people did for beauty. Yet it wasn't just about hair color. It was about what that color represented. You weren't just changing your hair, you were reshaping your entire identity. You were trying to align yourself with a mythical version of womanhood, one that was unattainable for most and deadly for some. Blonde was a shortcut to grace, love, and heaven. It wasn't fair, but then again, nothing about medieval beauty was. Historians still debate how much pressure women really felt to conform to these blonde ideals. Some scholars argue it was mostly limited to elite circles. Radiant tonight, you manage a faint smile. You're starving, but that's intentional. You've stopped eating, you've erased your eyebrows, and you've shrunk your mouth into a delicate, polite smirk. But you're not done yet. Now it's time to discuss the final and perhaps most unattainable aspect of medieval beauty: purity. This isn't just about being physically pure. It's the big one that weighed on every girl from the moment she could walk in a straight line: virginity. We're not talking about the real kind. Instead, we're focused on a fantasy version of chastity intertwined with religious doctrine, courtly love poetry, and a fair amount of wishful thinking. This is the virgin ideal of the Middle Ages. A beautiful woman wasn't just supposed to be appealing, she had to seem like she'd never even heard of sex. If she was married, ideally she'd still appear virginal. The standard was absurd, ethereal, and untouchable. She was graceful, but entirely innocent, mysterious, yet morally clear. Essentially, you were expected to be a walking contradiction in an expensive dress. This notion came from the religious context of the time. The Virgin Mary was the ultimate role model. She was viewed as the perfect woman, kind, obedient, selfless, and forever untouched. Artists and poets went to great lengths to make her the center of womanhood. That meant real women, living and breathing, were expected to mold themselves into that impossible figure: pale, passive, and pure. Let's put you in the mindset. You're 13, maybe 14. You're old enough for marriage talks to begin. Your mother has already warned you to walk modestly, avoid eye contact with men, and never speak above a whisper unless someone directly addresses you. You've been taught how to sit with your ankles crossed, lower your eyes, and say no with just enough angelic confusion. You've also been cautioned that even showing too much interest in anything might lead people to think you're impure. After all, passion was suspect. Even your clothing reflects this strange mix of innocence and allure. Your dress might be modest in style, but made from luxurious fabrics that whisper privilege. You might wear a veil over your hair, not just for fashion, but because visible hair was linked to temptation. The more covered you were, the more virtuous you seemed. Modesty wasn't just encouraged, it was legally enforced in some regions. In parts of medieval Italy, there were laws about how much skin unmarried women could show. Yes, they had purity police. There's a captivating story about Agnes of Rome, a 12-year-old girl sainted for refusing to marry and defending her chastity to the death. Her tale became popular among young women, taught as a lesson in devotion and moral superiority. In art, she's often depicted with a lamb, a symbol of innocence, and a face so expressionless you might think she was mildly sedated. This was apparently the vibe everyone was supposed to mimic: pure, passive, silent. And here's the kicker: even your physical features had to reflect your purity. A small nose, delicate and modest. Large eyes, fine as long as they didn't sparkle with curiosity. A high, smooth forehead, because nothing says virgin like a blank canvas above your brows. Medieval writers described beautiful women as having skin whiter than milk, hair like golden threads, and voices so soft they couldn't disturb a bird. That last one sounds poetic until you realize it basically means you shouldn't speak above a whisper at all. Now, let's talk about hair for a moment. In medieval symbolism, hair was significant. Loose hair on a woman was linked to seduction, danger, and a lack of control. That's why brides wore their hair down only on their wedding day, symbolizing both virginity and transition. After that, it was covered or braided tightly. Leaving it loose would be like walking around with a neon sign that said "Maybe a temptress." The rules were unspoken but strict. You didn't want to be mistaken for a loose woman because the repercussions were severe. Speaking of which, falling short of this ideal brought more than just social consequences. It carried real physical, Risks. A woman suspected of sexual impurity could face shame, disinheritance, exile, or even death. It didn't take much: a rumor, a jealous suitor, an ill-timed encounter in a garden. The daughters of noble families were political assets. If a girl's virginity was questioned, it could ruin entire marriage alliances. So yes, the pressure was real and constant. There's a curious academic debate about whether these purity standards truly affected women's daily lives or if they were just idealized projections from male-dominated literature and religious teachings. On one hand, poetry from that time is filled with references to untouched maidens and ideal beauties. On the other hand, real women sometimes manage to navigate the system. Some use their virgin reputations as leverage, while others fake their virginity with herbs and clever stories. A few even went full holy maiden, joining convents to escape the marriage mess entirely. As an interesting historical note, in some areas, midwives were trained to restore virginity through minor surgeries or herbal treatments, essentially the medieval version of a hymenoplasty. It wasn't common, but it did happen. Reputation was everything, and people would go to great lengths to protect it. Yet, despite all these impossible expectations, women still laughed, gossiped, flirted, and even loved. They wrote poems, traded secrets, and found moments of rebellion, all while doing so behind veils and under layers of fabric. But no, because now comes the part that ties it all together. Being thin, not just thin but fragile and delicate, meant you were one skipped meal away from sainthood. In the Middle Ages, looking like you hadn't eaten in days wasn't just fashionable. It was holy. Fasting wasn't only for monks and mystics. Among noble women, not eating became a sign of both spiritual devotion and social superiority. The thinner you were, the more virtuous you were thought to be. A woman with a full figure might be seen as healthy, but she also faced suspicion of indulgence, gluttony, or even moral weakness. The ideal body was soft yet slight, delicate yet shapely. It resembled a sculpture that might break if you breathed on it too hard. This practice wasn't quiet or internal. In many aristocratic courts, fasting was flaunted. Women attended feasts but barely touched the food, sipping wine or picking at a piece of bread with exaggerated grace. It wasn't just about health, it was also about power. Denying yourself pleasure, especially in public, sent a clear message: I am in control. I am closer to God. I am better than you. Now let's talk about St. Catherine of Siena. She is one of the most famous examples of religious fasting in the medieval era. Catherine claimed to survive for years on nothing but the Eucharist, literally a piece of communion bread. Some historians today think she may have had a condition now recognized as anorexia, although no one called it that back then. Her starvation was seen as divine devotion. She was canonized, and her gaunt, sunken, glowing image became part of the beauty and spiritual ideal for women for centuries. Here's where it gets murkier. Spiritual purity and physical appearance weren't just linked, they were indistinguishable. A naturally thin and pale woman could be seen as blessed, maybe even saintly. A woman who had to work for it through starvation, herbs that induced vomiting, or long nights of self-flagellation was still admired, but for different reasons. She was respected for her suffering. There are also quirky details, like the popularity of something called holy anorexia. This wasn't a medical term. It was a spiritual label for women who fasted to the point of hallucination and ecstasy. Some noble families even encouraged this behavior in their daughters, seeing it as a shortcut to sainthood, or at least a way to boost the family's religious prestige. That's right, starving your child could be a career move. Men did similar things, especially in monasteries, but it affected women differently. Fasting became not just a religious act but a gender performance. You weren't just purging your body of sin, you were proving you were too holy for hunger, too pure for earthly needs. Your body wasn't yours anymore. It was a shrine. But let's rewind to the daily grind. Imagine waking up in your cold stone chamber, with a roaring fire. That doesn't do much. Your maid brings in your breakfast, a stale crust of rye and a cup of goat's milk. But you wave it away. You're fasting, which really just means keeping up appearances. You have headaches, your limbs feel weak, but you smile faintly and go about your day. You faint during morning prayers, and everyone pretends not to notice. Among your circle of noble women, there's an unspoken competition. Who can eat the least, go the longest between meals, or survive on herbs and broth while still standing upright at Mass? It's brutal, it's isolating, it's revered, even fashion reinforced this. Gowns were tight around the rib cage and torso, emphasizing a narrow waist. Lacing cinched the body, an early form of corsetry, if not full corsets. Some gowns had no stretch and could barely accommodate a full breath, let alone a meal. The silhouette of the day was long, narrow, almost reed-like. Rounded curves were acceptable, and hips and busts had their place, but the stomach had to be flat, the ribs discreet. Your whole frame was supposed to say, "I exist on air and prayer." Scholars still debate how far these standards reached. Did all noble women really starve themselves? Or were these ideals exaggerated by male poets, clerics, and artists projecting their fantasies onto female bodies? There's definitely truth to that. A lot we know comes from second-hand sources, men writing about women, artists painting exaggerated saints, and religious leaders praising devotion while quietly ruining lives. The physical evidence where it exists, corseted bones, letters, manuscripts suggests. Many women lived these expectations day after day. There were also class divisions, of course. Peasant women couldn't afford to fast, nor would anyone expect them to. They needed energy for field work, childbirth, and constant labor. But as you climbed the social ladder, your plate had to stay emptier. The irony is that the rich had access to food and were praised for pretending they didn't want it. And just to drive this point home, here's a strange little fact. Some women would chew food and then discreetly spit it into napkins to avoid digesting it. That's right, predigestion, food rejection, a casual court-approved eating disorder centuries before anyone had a name for it. So now you find yourself at dinner time in your candlelit hall. Your lord is eating roast pheasant. The smell is so rich it makes your stomach twist. You sip watered wine and pretend to be indifferent. Your gown is tight across your ribs, and you haven't eaten a full meal in days, but everyone praises your lightness and grace. You feel dizzy, and someone leans over and says, "You look." Version something Mona Lisa level, no open laughter that would reveal too much, plus joy wasn't seen as especially feminine. You were supposed to look ethereal and slightly sad, as if you were waiting for your husband to return from war or for God to call you home. Anything more enthusiastic risked being seen as inappropriate. There's a fringe theory among historians, definitely debated, that upper-class women were sometimes trained to suppress laughter. The idea was that joy made the face contort, which could show teeth, deepen smile lines, or ruin the delicate balance of their powdered skin. Whether this was formal instruction or just the result of relentless social pressure, we may never know, but the idea of facial restraint was very real. Beauty wasn't just about how you looked. It was about how still you could remain. Let's pause and consider this. Imagine being a teenager in this world. Your friends are all trying to make their teeth smaller and less noticeable. No braces, no whitening strips, just prayers and pumice. If you were born with crooked or large teeth, tough luck. You might be laughed at, avoided, or quietly teased. Some wealthier families even went so far as to remove visible teeth to make their daughters' mouths look smaller. The pain and risk of infection were considered worth it for the chance of a good marriage. It wasn't all hopeless though. Some rare medieval beauty manuals, tucked away in monastic libraries, offered gentle remedies for whitening teeth and freshening breath without destroying your mouth entirely. One manuscript recommends rubbing sage leaves on the teeth and drinking wine infused with mint. Honestly, that's one of the more reasonable tips we've heard so far. Yet, it's the quiet cruelty that lingers, the idea that you must silence your body to be seen as good. You had to shrink everything: your voice, your mouth, your appetite. The smaller you appeared, both literally and metaphorically, the more perfect you became. So here you are again, sitting in your chamber. You haven't smiled in hours. You chew fennel seeds between meals and scrape your teeth with crushed eggshells. You avoid laughing even when something's funny, because beauty in this time isn't joy, it's discipline. And if your teeth are starting to hurt, don't worry, that just means it's working. Your forehead is now the envy of every noblewoman from London to Lubeck. You've sacrificed your eyebrows, your scalp, and probably your sanity, but you're finally achieving that prized look, a pale, expressionless canvas ready to be admired and judged. But don't think you can relax just yet. Tonight, we descend further into the mouth of madness. We're talking teeth, tiny, discreet, impossibly delicate teeth that never show, never smile too widely, and absolutely must not look like you've ever eaten anything harder than a grape. In medieval beauty standards, the mouth was a contradiction. It had to be there, obviously, but it shouldn't do much. No loud laughing, no toothy grins, and no yelling across the courtyard because your goat got loose again. Lips were meant to stay closed, demure and mysterious, and the smaller your teeth were, the better. Ideally, your teeth were white, small, evenly spaced, and invisible. 90% of the time. If someone actually saw your teeth, you were doing femininity wrong. This standard was rooted in more than just aesthetic taste. It had moral connotations. A small, closed mouth was seen as a sign of modesty and self-control. Large teeth or a wide mouth, by contrast, were linked to gluttony, vulgarity, and sometimes even sexual promiscuity. Women with big mouths were seen as loud and opinionated, or worst of all, unladylike. The goal was to seem like you barely existed, just a soft breeze of a person with delicate bone structure and no opinions. There's a fascinating passage in a 14th century French romance where the male hero praises the heroine's beauty by saying her teeth are so fine and small that they would not break the skin of a grape. Romantic, right? Unless you're eating steak, then you're doomed. It's hard to chew knobbly when your teeth are functionally ornamental, but medieval oral hygiene? That was another nightmare altogether. They didn't exactly have Colgate. People used a mix of herbs, vinegar, salt, and even burnt rosemary ash to scrub their teeth, assuming they even bothered. Most commoners didn't. Among the elite, it was a little more common, but the focus was more on appearance than health. So while you might rub your gums raw trying to whiten your teeth, the idea of actually preventing tooth decay wasn't a priority. This leads us to one of the more ironic tragedies of the period. The women who tried hardest to maintain their teeth often did the most damage. There are records of women using ground coral and brick dust to polish their enamel. Yes, brick dust. It looked fine until their enamel was completely gone and their teeth began crumbling in their gums. The ultimate in medieval beauty, small, pearly teeth that eventually rotted out of your skull. But at least you looked pious doing it. Then there was the matter of breath. You couldn't show off your tiny, perfect teeth with breath that smelled like boiled eel and sadness. Medieval women often chewed herbs like parsley, mint, or cloves. Some also used rosewater mouth rinses, which didn't do much medically but at least covered up the evidence of a questionable diet. In some parts of Italy, women were known to chew fennel seeds and even sprinkle ground cinnamon before social occasions. You're pale, hollow, hairless in all the wrong places, and your mouth is small enough to pass medieval inspection. At this point, you should be golden, right? Made you human, and being human was frowned upon. Some women didn't just stop at hair removal. They dyed their scalp and the remaining fringe of hair around the forehead to make their skin look even whiter in contrast. Imagine applying a layer of white chalk or powdered bone dust just above your eyebrows. The whole face glowed with an unnatural paleness. It wasn't flattering or realistic. It was expected. None of this was painless. Infections were common. The tools were primitive, and hygiene questionable. Any slip of the hand could lead to an open wound or raw skin. You couldn't take a break from this routine. Let your hairline creep forward even a little, and the whispers began. Was she getting lazy? Had she lost her virtue? Maybe she was poor or worse. Not everyone went along with this madness. In some parts of medieval Europe, especially rural areas, women ignored this trend. They had more urgent concerns like not freezing to death or dying in childbirth. But among the nobility and courts from Paris to London, this was the standard. Beauty was not just about looks. It was a social agreement. Break it and you risked losing marriage prospects, reputation, or even inheritance. Historians still debate how widespread this forehead obsession really was. Some say it was limited to fashion-obsessed courts. Others think it reached into middle class households where women copied the elite out of desire or need. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, like most historical matters. But it's clear that a high forehead became a symbol of femininity, virtue, and aristocratic grace. It's unsettling. In a world where women had few choices, controlling their appearance was one of the only ways to express identity. But even that choice was a trap. You weren't choosing how to look. You were choosing how to suffer. You lean forward in your candlelit mirror, skin burning from vinegar, and your scalp red from plucking. Your hairline is now high enough to pass inspection, and your eyebrows are nearly gone. You look serene, silent, unreadable, and honestly, kind of haunted. Your skin is pale enough. Great. You look like a walking page from an ancient manuscript. But now, it's time to tackle something even weirder. Your forehead dot in the Middle Ages, the higher it was, the more attractive you were. If you think today's contouring routines are extreme, brace yourself. You are literally plucking back your hairline with tweezers, one hair at a time. This isn't a joke. The ideal medieval woman had a forehead that stretched halfway to her scalp. It signified intelligence, nobility, and spiritual purity. To achieve this look, women plucked, shaved, or even rubbed their skin raw with walnut oil or bandages soaked in vinegar to force the hair to fall out. Eyebrows gone, baby hairs gone. Sometimes they even shaved an inch or two off the top of their heads to push that hairline even further back. Think of it as the original five-head. Historians still debate why this forehead fixation existed. Was it based on actual beauty ideals, or did it come from religious art? Many images of the Virgin Mary depicted her with a high, smooth forehead. No surprise there, since the church influenced most art and culture. Women were expected to model themselves after the divine. A smooth, expressionless brow symbolized calm and control. You weren't supposed to look emotional. You were to look serene. Now imagine the daily upkeep. You sit by the hearth in the dim light of early morning, tweezers in hand, yanking out strands of hair while trying not to cry. If you cry, your skin swells, and then you must use crushed rose petals under your eyes to reduce the puffiness. Beauty in this world was a job with no days off. There's a peculiar story from medieval France about a noblewoman named Isabeau of Bavaria. According to legend, and maybe some dramatized accounts, she plucked her hairline so aggressively that it permanently damaged her follicles. For years afterward, she wore elaborate headdresses to hide the uneven patches. These headpieces became so large and heavy that they caused neck problems. And no, there were no chiropractors back then, just prayer. Speaking of headgear, the high forehead didn't work alone. It came with elaborate wimples, hennons, and snoods which helped frame and highlight the forehead. The hennon, that cone-shaped princess hat seen in fairy tales, was often worn tilted back to put the forehead on display. Bonus points if your forehead was visibly veiny. That meant your skin was thin and delicate like parchment, and everyone loved parchment. What's particularly funny and kind of terrible is that even if you didn't have the right type of forehead, you still had to pretend. Portrait artists would stretch your face and exaggerate your brow whether you liked it or not. In fact, some modern historians now think many of those ideal proportions in medieval portraits weren't real at all. They were edited. Like today's Instagram filters smooth out your features. Some things never changed. No one wanted to be the woman at court with a pretty face but bad breath. Here's where it gets stranger. In some medieval courts, there was an unspoken rule about when a woman could show her teeth. A smile was allowed, but only the faintest, tightest one. Hey everyone, tonight we're jumping into a world where beauty wasn't just painful, it was truly frightening. Picture this. It's the Middle Ages, and to be considered beautiful, you had to look half dead. Think ghostly pale skin, sunken cheeks, and eyes so dark they looked bruised. You probably won't survive this, but don't worry, it's just a bedtime story. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy my content. Let me know what time it is and where you're watching from. I always love seeing who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights and maybe turn on a fan for some background noise. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a cold stone chamber, dimly lit by flickering candles. The air smells of beeswax and old wool. You sit in front of a warped bronze mirror, trying to perfect your look. But what exactly was considered perfect in the 14th century? First, if your skin had any color, you were already behind. Pale skin wasn't just a preference, it was a requirement. It shouted wealth. If you were tanned, it meant you worked outdoors. Like a peasant. Yikes. But just being pale wasn't enough. You needed translucent skin with visible blue veins running along your forehead and chest. That sickly, almost cadaverous appearance was the peak of beauty. So, how did people achieve this look? Mostly through a horrifying mix of bloodletting and staying indoors like a medieval vampire. Some even smeared a thick paste of vinegar, crushed pearls, and lead on their faces to bleach their skin. Yep, actual lead. It burned, corroded skin, and eventually poisoned their blood. But hey, at least they looked aristocratic. One well-known example is Queen Elizabeth of York. Portraits of her show an impossibly pale face, hollow cheeks, and dark eyes framed by a high forehead, all considered textbook beauty at the time. But scholars debate whether these depictions were real or just artistic wishes. Maybe she looked like that, or maybe she didn't. What we do know is that looking like death warmed over was a whole aesthetic, and women lean heavily into it. Now, imagine trying to achieve that signature sunken cheek look without contouring kits. You'd resort to actual starvation. Wealthy women were known to limit their food intake not only to stay thin but to maintain that slightly hollow, ethereal face. Some would even suck on lemons or rub them on their skin, hoping the acid would drain the plumpness from their cheeks. Sounds made up, right? Nope, that was a real medieval tip passed between ladies. Let's also consider the role of artists. Medieval painters didn't focus on realism. The faces they painted were filtered through layers of religious beliefs and class fantasies. Smooth, deathly skin wasn't just beautiful, it was holy. A pure soul had to reside in a pure body, which meant no flaws, no color, and no warmth. If you were lucky, the local painter would add gold leaf to brighten your halo. Without it, you looked like a very fashionable ghost. Here's a strange, almost funny twist. While noble women were trying desperately to look pale and frail, peasant women were full of life. They had sun-kissed skin from working in the fields, strong arms from hauling water, and rosy cheeks from fresh air. To the elite, this was horrifying, but honestly, it was kind of refreshing. Still, the divide was serious. If a noble woman got too much sun and darkened her skin, it could be scandalous. She might lose status or worse, be thought to be slipping morally. Beauty and virtue were tightly connected. Your face didn't just represent you, it screamed your entire identity. If it didn't meet the cold pale standard, society made sure you knew it. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. There was a trend, especially in northern Italy, of using leeches for both medical and beauty purposes. Want to get rid of a pimple or lighten your skin a few shades? Just slap a few leeches on your face and let them do their thing. People actually believed that the blood they sucked out would remove impurities. Scientific? Not at all. Painful? Definitely. Effective? Debatable. Speaking of debates, there's an ongoing discussion among scholars about whether this beauty ideal was enforced more through actual fashion or through literature and art. Some historians argue that most women never fully adopted these looks. It was more aspirational than literal. Others suggest that many upper-class women, especially in court, took these standards seriously and changed their bodies and routines to meet them. Which side is right? We may never know. Diaries from that time are rare, and beauty wasn't something people wrote about openly, it was just expected. The real brutality of these standards wasn't just in the lead creams or starvation tactics. It was in the silence. There was no escape, no movement. If you didn't conform, you weren't just unfashionable, you were suspect. Maybe sinful, maybe diseased, maybe both. So, you stare at your reflection in that blurry mirror. Your skin stings from the vinegar, and your cheeks ache from fasting. The candle flickers, and you catch your face from a different angle. Let's not forget the eyebrows. They had to go too. Women tweezed them until only a faint shadow remained. This wasn't because they hated expression. It was because eyebrows were considered distracting and even vulgar. A woman's face was meant to be a clean slate, like a holy relic or a statue. Emotions were messy.